I need that encouragement. It's always good to see people face to face again, instead of looking at people through a screen. So thank you for being here, and I hope you're enjoying the conference. The topics that we're going to discuss today is mainly around real-time transportation visibility. Now, the concept is probably not as well known in the South African or African context compared to what it is in Europe and the States, but it is certainly an issue that needs to be addressed in most businesses today to be able to improve on our performance and the actual overall visibility of our total supply chain. Now, the agenda, we're just going to talk a little bit about the concepts, a little bit about the industry overview, typical problems and challenges that supply chain companies face. We have a little bit of a customer case study, a little video that we'll play just to give you a little bit of an experience of one of our customers in Europe, how they approached the subject matter and the achievements and the reasons behind that. We're going to talk very briefly around machine learning and artificial intelligence, a little bit about dashboard reporting, and then conclusion. It's going to be fairly informal, so if there are any questions, depending on how it goes, we can leave that till the end. But if there's something, a pressing matter straight away, just please put up your hand and we can address that as we go. Now, if we look at, I think we're all used to making use of some of this sort of technology in a B2C type environment. We order things through Take a Lot or Amazon. People talk about the Amazon experience. So we are all very well au fait and familiar with the technology behind it. You place an order on a website and immediately you get some sort of a response in terms of a SLA or a service level agreement as to when those goods will be delivered. Typically, it's starting off. The longer the time frame, it will probably say we can deliver between 2 and 3 business days or whatever the case is. But the closer you get to that D-Day, you get more and more information as it goes along. Similar to, we all use Uber or Lyft or one of those sort of ride-hailing sort of apps. We know exactly where the vehicle is and what's happening and what the status is. The same when it comes to actual food deliveries as well. Now, the thing that I find quite strange is that we don't have that in the business-to-business type environment. Yet we've got hundreds of thousands and millions of rands of orders flowing between companies, from suppliers to factories to warehouses, whatever the case is, but we really don't have the same visibility that we have in the B2C type world. And that type of missing link, if you could call it that, prompted a lot of companies to actually start investing into platforms that do that type of thing in the business world. And the big thing is that we need to be able to do it across the total supply chain. From it's not only the specific sections. We'll look at a typical supply chain just now, but it's not typically only for specific components. We're trying to get visibility across the full spectrum of the supply chain. Now, if we look at this example, that's a typical simplified supply chain process. I don't have a pointer here, but if you start on the right-hand side, you have suppliers supplying factories with raw material. We have factories manufacturing goods stored in warehouses, delivered to retailers. At the end of the day, we have the consumers that consume the products that we do, that we made. Now, one of the main issues is how do we measure the performance of these typical functional areas. If we look at a supplier of raw material, the factory, there's typically procurement processes involved, there's buyers. And what is the main purpose of a buyer? How do we measure the success of a buyer? Now, I'm generalizing here, but in many cases, the main job of a buyer is to screw the supplier, in terms of pricing, excuse my language. But that really, in a lot of cases, and a lot of businesses actually measure the performance based on that sort of procedure. So what happens is that a buyer tries to squeeze the price down as far as possible. And what is the counter? What is the retaliation from a supplier? The typical thing is I'm losing margin, so the second best thing I can do is to dictate the sort of volumes that you have to purchase. So typical retaliation would be, okay, we give you that extra 2% discount, but you have to order minimum quantities of X, Y, Z, whatever the case is. Now, in many cases, the buyer is quite happy that he's achieved his target of driving the price per unit down. But what happens in the factory environment? All of a sudden, the factory sits with a whole host of additional products or larger volumes that they anticipated. And again, based on the measurement of a typical production house or production manager or director or whatever the case is, how do we measure his performance? We measure on output. We measure on productivity. If the factory can produce 100 units per day, and he does 90, he's 90% productive, or 110, he's 10% over his target, so to speak. So he ends up, and because he's now sitting with an oversupply of raw materials, what does he do? He tries to push the limits in terms of making goods as fast and as many as possible, just to get rid of his excess raw material stock. What happens to the poor guy in the middle who runs the warehouse? How do you measure that performance? Typically, we talk about stock turnover, turnarounds of stock items, utilization of space. But at the end of the day, everything evolves around what the consumer actually wishes to buy or wants to buy or is going to buy. So a typical example, as we mentioned now, is a push-type supply system. Now, between all these processes, you've got movement of goods, you've got information flow, but in essence, what we try to achieve is to measure the full supply chain and manage the full supply chain as a unit instead of these different silos all on its own. Sales, relatively simple. I think we all know salespeople, very optimistic and people that will always sort of add a little bit extra in terms of what is really possible to achieve. So we don't want to look negative, and there's always a push to pretend that we're going to sell more than what we do. And a couple of months into the financial year, what is the next step? The accountants find out that we're not making the figures, so we need to re-look at the whole budget and revisit the forecasts and everything that goes with it. And just a show of hands, who've been involved in these reforecasting exercises in your own businesses? Everybody? Now, how many of you, again, show of hands, are people that actually sat in one of these meetings and the targets and the forecast have been adjusted upwards? Ever? That's good. It's fairly unique, but in most cases we overestimate the potential sales that we're going to achieve, and at the end of the day we need to readjust and get it all down to reality. So what we're trying to say is that we need to look at ways of deciding what we're going to manufacture based on potential sales. Now, forecasting, I think there are a lot of models around forecasting, and there's machine learning and algorithms that calculate historic usage and forecasting in terms of potential usage in future, which is all very well. But at the end of the day, it's very difficult to have accurate forecasting in any type of environment. So what we try to do is to replenish stock as they get used and sold, and based on the lead times in the whole supply chain, that would obviously pretend or ensure that we have the right stock levels in terms of that. So that's just a little bit of background. But in terms of the full picture of the visibility side, we have to be able to provide visibility to all these stakeholders within that supply chain. Now, this is, as I said, a fairly simplified version, but it can be quite complex. Now, traditionally, we typically are working with the more reactive type of process. And if we can just relate to that, when a truck gets fully loaded in the morning and off it goes to do all its deliveries, the first time that we really know what's going on is the time when he gets back to the yard in the evening, docks his device if he has anything, or hands in his delivery notes or PODs together with his strip sheets, and then only did we know what was actually happening during the course of the day. So we moved forward from that, and there's the advent of telematics type systems, tracking devices and so on. It became much more real time, so we are able to see or have a visual picture of where we are in terms of the process. But to be honest, in my experience over the years in terms of how people use telematics, South Africa has been in the forefront with the development of a lot of these technologies many, many years ago. Some of those South African companies today are global players and has done extremely well with development. But our main emphasis has always been on risk management and driver control. It never really got to the point where it's used as a management tool on a minute-by-minute basis to really understand how does the plan actually happen against that actual. And we certainly, and I say it with total conviction, it's a little bit sad to be honest, that in our South African context, I used to work in a 3PL environment for 10 years, and one of my biggest frustrations is that we have these wonderful tools to our disposal, and we only use it when there's a crisis. And that really, if I compare what we see in Europe at the moment and how people use these tools in a day-to-day, minute-to-minute type environment, it makes a world of difference in terms of the end results, in terms of what we do. So the next step is to really get into a predictive type visibility mode, and that is where we use the real-time issues and use artificial intelligence and machine learning to predict what would happen or what's going to happen. And that's the main aim of all these RTTV or real-time transportation visibility solutions, is really to try and get to that stage where we can start predicting what will happen based on historic data, and then be able to automate some of the processes in the same breath. Now, I think we're all familiar with Gartner. I'm not sure these numbers would probably not be visible from the back. But what they've done, this is a little bit outdated. This is in 2018. They put out a survey to executives in a number of big businesses, and the question that they asked is, what is the 3 most important supply chain initiatives that was planned for 2019? And if we go through the list, I can barely read them, but the top one is really the supply chain visibility type issue. It's in terms of inventory optimization, which is a major factor in everybody's lives, to make sure that we don't overstock and we don't sit with unnecessary items that could become obsolete or have to be disposed of. And then also brand analytics and decision-making tools, which is typically the BI and insights, or there's so many words and names for that type of technology. So those are really the 3 top items that was identified in terms of where they see the spend for the next year, which was, in that time, it was 2019. There was another study conducted by PwC in Germany, and they looked at specifically, they call them digital supply chain champions, that on average they generated 8% more turnover than their peers and reduced their cost by 7%. So you really sit with a double whammy where there's increase in sales as well as a decrease in cost in terms of profitability. Gartner also brought out a statement a couple of years ago that by 2023, 50% of global product-centric enterprises will have invested in real-time transportation visibility platforms. And look, Gartner is not the be-all and end-all. I think a lot of we can use it as guidance. It is something that one can use, especially when it comes to the choosing of suppliers in specific type environments. They do a lot of work in investigating and analyzing businesses in specific sectors and bring out what they call this magic quadrant that gives us the opportunity to look at different suppliers in this industry and then sort of assist you in making a call as to what the best supplier is for what you want to achieve at the end of the day. Now, the magic quadrant, if you look at the vertical scale, it deals with the ability to execute. And the horizontal one, the criteria is mainly the completeness of vision. And then you've got the 4 quadrants. The top right-hand corner, they regard as the leaders in the specific field. The top left is the challengers, and obviously you are placed in specific sectors and positions, and it's quite a race with some of these suppliers or vendors to see where the next position is that your company sits at. This is quite a recent one. This was March 2022, so it's very relevant. And if you can see, the 2 leaders are mainly American companies, Project 44 and 4Kites. I think we had a discussion yesterday. 4Kites did some presentation. We joked about it, and he said he'll give me his slides, and I can just duplicate and run it today. So, but we did not do that. Us, Shippeo, sits on the borderline, so it is a challenge for us now to move into that leadership block. To achieve that, you need to be a global player, and we're busy with that whole expansion at the moment. And that's hence my situation in South Africa. We've identified Africa as one of the growth markets. The second one is Americas, obviously, as well. So we've opened up offices in America, 2 offices there, and now starting in Africa as well to see if we can improve that situation. But the analysis is always it gives direction. It is quite valuable for a lot of potential customers, users of this sort of technology. They go into a lot of detail regarding historic customer satisfaction. They specifically concentrate a lot on the referrals of how many of your customers would refer you to a peer or another customer. We're very proud to say that we were a 97% rating on that 90% of our customers would refer us to somebody else, which is something that we hold very dearly. Now, another Gartner global supply chain measure or analysis that they do is to indicate the top 25 global supply chain companies in the world. I don't want to go through the details of individual companies as such, but it gives, again, if you're in one of those sort of company sectors, it's always good to do a little bit of analysis to see why and how these guys are in those positions that you see. If you look at Cisco, the Schneider Electrical, Johnson & Johnson, PepsiCo, Pfizer, Intel, all those sort of companies, It's always worthwhile, if you want to make a selection of who you want to deal with, is to sort of investigate a little bit further into how these guys do their thing and how they got to those positions based on technologies, processes, and everything that goes with that. Interesting to see that on the circle on the right are people that missed the cut of the top 25. And there's a few prominent companies, Amazon, Apple, McDonald's, Unilever, Procter & Gamble, and so on. But it's not to say that these guys are doing badly. It is nothing to do with that. It's just a question of a fairly subjective rating, I would think. But it gives an indication. So my advice would be for somebody to go into a little bit more detail, investigate how these companies operate and what the typical success factors are that they would do. Now, if we look at visibility, what is the real benefits that we bring to the table? The first one is typically your customer satisfaction. We all try to satisfy our customers, to improve customer experience, and that is quite important for us to go further in life itself. The next one is basically around the lack of information and how do you deal with this. Now, I just want to quote a typical example that we're working with in South Africa specifically. We've got a chemical company that's got about 8 factories across the country. They've got quite a few hundreds of clients all over. Orders are placed at a central point in their planning office, and then these orders are channeled through to the different factories who choose their carriers or subcontractors that they use to deliver the product. And then the fun starts, because now Mr. Customer phones the central planning office to inquire where is my load, because from there he needs to understand that he either has to shut down his production line if the goods don't arrive in time. There's a whole host of different implications depending on the type of business that they are in. Once they phone the planning office, then the planning office has to phone the factory, because the planning office don't really know to which subcontractor or which truck that order has been allocated to. The factory phones the subcontractor. He's not allowed to speak to the driver. Subcontractor phones the driver, feedback back to the factory, so it becomes a whole host of different phone calls, and a lot of people's time goes into the process to try and find out what's going on. Now, what a visibility platform would do is to create access to all these different parties, either through a messaging service, SMS or emails, or give them access through a portal to the platform, which is normally very secure. So the customer can has a visual of the actual position of where the vehicle currently is, and the most important thing is the ETA. When is that vehicle going to arrive at its destination, to allow you to start planning and make sure that you've got the right equipment to offload and everything that goes with that. So another specific issue around the efficiency of warehouses and the operating costs associated with it. Again, in many cases there are specialized equipment necessary that needs to be ready at the time when the load arrives, so that could be deployed properly and to improve the productivity levels relating to that. The fourth item, we talk about the actual measurement of performance, and the measurement of performance mainly is around carriers. So we understand what is the typical turnaround times, where do we have the most delays, at which depots, which warehouses, which DCs, which retail outlet store, so that we can start building up a profile. And also when it comes to carriers, that we can start renegotiating rates if necessary based on the performance. And the last item is not that much relevant in a the road transport environment, it's mainly when it comes to penalties and costs, with the shipping side of things. Now, and those are typically, if you look at the figures at the bottom, that's based on some of our customer base actual figures, so it's fairly realistic. In every situation, we always try to get a positive return on investment. We would physically walk away from a deal if we cannot prove that there's a benefit in, for the company itself. Now, the latest development that we were busy with the last couple of months is the ocean visibility, as we call it, and that has to do with container tracking, and an element that's very pertinent in that South African context because of the number of goods that we import from overseas, mainly the East. So that becomes a whole different animal because once a booking, I don't know who of you are in the container shipping environment, I think they will all agree that that's quite a tough nut to keep track of. So first thing is a booking with a freight forwarder or the shipping line. That empty container is sent to the warehouse to be loaded. That we talk about the gate out empty, which is the container is empty out by the gate, and then taken to the warehouse, it gets loaded. So gate in full, when the container gets back, it gets loaded or onto a vessel or a ship. And then that ship departs that port of origin on its way to do the delivery itself. The next step would be for not many people realize or know, and it's not always disclosed, but in many cases, that vessel is taken to a actual transshipment port, where typically similar to a hub and spoke type concept on road transport or a consolidation process, the whole ship is offloaded and reloaded, or portions of the load is reloaded onto another vessel to complete its journey to the destination port, where it enters the harbor, and then obviously that same container needs to get to the customer, and the empty container needs to get back. So it is a much more complex process. We are contracting now with people that do GPS tracking of vessels so that we know physically where that ship is on the ocean itself. We calculate ETAs based on the algorithms, and at the end of the day, we are able to get a fairly good prediction of an ETA as to when the goods would arrive. But the downside is major costs that could be incurred in terms of detention charges and demurrage rates, which could run into plenty money depending on the situation itself. Now, I just want to play this short video. This is one of the customers in Europe, Carrefour, which is one of the largest retail stores in Europe. But let's listen to it first, and then we can make a few comments on the rest.
Carrefour Group is one of the largest retail chains in Europe and one of the largest in the world, with more than 12,000 stores in 130 countries around Europe. Carrefour also has more than 10,000 employees and a turnover of about 4 billion euros.
Carrefour Belgium has a very specific position because a huge part of our stores are operated by franchised store owners. One of the big challenges is definitely to keep our franchised operation to a high level of satisfaction. This means that our operation has to be modified, customized to serve our franchised store network in the best manner, which we also have to invest in the right technology to give them also the necessary visibility of the operations, especially geared towards their satisfaction.
For the supply chain department, on-time arrival of our trucks is a key element of service that we give to the stores. We have about 450 trips and about 850 store deliveries every day. Without visibility, people get stressed because they do not know when the truck will arrive. So what they start doing then is taking the phone, trying to call other parties, call center, transportation department, other PCs. They want to know when it's going to and we hope to take away their stress with an instant and upfront information.
It's really important to know when the truck will be here, so if we have to wait for an hour for the delivery, then we can make plans for our personnel.
De grote uitdaging van dit depot is uiteraard de korte doorlooptijd tussen inbound en outbound, verkoppeld aan de hoge volumes om deze goed onder controle te krijgen. Dat is de belangrijkste oorzaak is dat we geen visibiliteit hebben op het inbound transport, dat de goederen niet tijdig kunnen gezonden worden naar de winkels, en het gevolg is dat cartoon geen verkoop heeft en dat uiteindelijk de goederen moeten verdiend worden, wat dat vooral waarschijnlijk een slechte zaak is.
We selected Shippeo amongst quite a lot of other visibility tools because Shippeo combines different transport activities out of our different transport platforms in real time in one platform, easy accessible by source. There are three main KPIs we follow with Shippeo. First of all is overall customer satisfaction of the store code. Secondly, it's also to measure planned arrival time versus minimized arrival time, especially to enhance productivity in the stores. And the third element, which is very important within the transport operation, is the turnaround time of a truck on site, which also is becoming much more visible with Shippeo. The additional advantage is as well that Shippeo is predictive. So it will already with artificial intelligence predict the arrival time of the truck in the stores.
I can update on my cell phone through SMS or through email when there is a problem with the truck or when it has just left and I can follow it in real time.
We use Shippeo in our DCs. If we know pretty much in advance that there might be a delay in the incoming flow, we can take corrective actions or reschedule the outgoing flows.
Real-time kan kijken waar de drugs van de inbound zich bevinden. Ik moet geen gebruik meer maken van e-mail, geen communicatie en dergelijke.
We highly recommend the use of Shippeo, not only in our franchise network, but also in our integrated network. Because from a supply chain department perspective, we believe strongly that it's giving accurate transport information, which should help you in the source to be more effective in the exception of the truck and also with mise en rayon of the goods within your store.
Okay, we're running a little bit short of time, so let's move on. The interesting three KPIs that they mentioned is obviously the turnaround time, customer satisfaction, and the plan versus actual. So those are really the key factors that they try to measure and to make sure that they achieve what they want to achieve. Now, the question is why now? Why is that investment now important in terms of what we're trying to do? The first one is that technology has changed drastically. If we look at in the past how we worked with EDIs, the API technology today just makes things, integration to different systems, so much simpler, so much easier, so much quicker and cost effective. So there's still an EDI type transactions that happens between shippers and carriers and so on, but it's estimated that that's only about 8% of the transactions. Carriers that traditionally have been fairly unsophisticated with their IT technology, we see a constant growth and enhancement of IT technologies, with carriers, and and they're reaching certain maturity levels, which makes the timing much more pertinent to do that now. The use of telematics and TMS, as I mentioned earlier, in some cases it's improving. there's no doubt, but I believe it's still far too slow. You know, we have these wonderful tools, and this is not a problem at operational level. I think this is a problem stemming right from C-level at board level, where I think in many cases, I might be not be popular saying this, but I think some CEOs in their own business don't really understand their own businesses properly in terms of the supply chain challenges that really happens. And what often happens is the guys sort of steer clear and don't want to look awkward if they can't answer questions, and in many cases that's sort of just thrown under the carpet and not being addressed. The cloud-based solutions, you know, everything today, there is very little, or in our case specifically, or these sort of platforms, there's no information or no technology or systems installed on local computers at all. It's all you need is an internet connection, stable and reliable, and that's all you need to drive this process, and it could be done from anywhere. You don't have to be on site, or you can sit on Clifton Beach with your cell phone and achieve some of these things. And obviously the return on investment when it comes to the lack of these big capital expenditure projects, the cloud-based technology just makes that return on investment so much easier and so much quicker to ensure that we do what we want to achieve. Now we're running out of time, so this is really going to be the last slide. But the big thing to have a successful, RTTV sort of solution is the integration capability, because we take information from so many different sources, and it depends on the customer situation. We analyze the business properly so we understand exactly where the touch points are, what needs to be integrated from which source system to where. And if you look at the different elements, we've got truck telematics. We currently already integrating to about 870, just under 900 different systems that we integrate to, that we can talk to and get data from and exchange data. We talk about TMS systems, warehouse management, ERP, TMS systems from a shipper's perspective as well as a carrier's perspective, handheld technology where there's driver apps, EPOD type apps, where that information is received from, port terminals, the actual shipping lines itself, and many more. It really depends on what we're dealing with and how we're going to get the best result in that process. But the data is everything. So we need to understand the data. We need to reason, have proper understanding of the reason why this data is there. And then obviously action needs to be taken. It's a circle. It's not something that starts and ends. It is a continuous process. And especially if we look at artificial intelligence and machine learning, which is the buzzword of today, if we thought that you can go home on a holiday and sit back and wait for AI to take over and do what you think it'll do, forget it. It's a boring process. It's a meticulous process. It's a repetitive process, and it's not something that one can just ignore. The one issue is that artificial intelligence is going to change the world upside down. There's no doubt about that. There are certain career choices that kids today need to think up very quickly, carefully in terms of what they're going to do in the long term, with regards to what is possible within the artificial intelligence and machine learning environment. So that's something that we really need to consider very, very closely. Those are just some of the touch points and areas where artificial intelligence and machine learning plays a role. The main thing is the moment you have a repetitive task, something that happens all the time, there's variations on the norm, and that's all artificial intelligence basically does. It's not taking over something. It's a question of making decisions easier. You can establish trends. You can predict potentially what could happen based on how you design the algorithms. But at the end of the day, it's not going to do the work for you. You know, you still have to take action on the process. This is just a quick slide in terms of ETAs, in terms of the typical APIs, routing APIs that you get. You know, accuracy, it just doesn't take all the data into consideration. Typical internet API, routing APIs are based on sedan vehicles, and if you look at a truck with all the restrictions and sizes and limitations that you have, you know, that obviously makes a big difference in terms of how we operate. The last point that I want to mention is the actual reporting side. What we do with the information, how we display, how do we end up producing information that's meaningful and actionable to the different players in the field. And in conclusion, I just believe the days are gone where people or companies compete based on products and prices and services. You're actually competing with the resilience and efficiency of your total supply chain. That to me is really what would make the difference in terms of people, you know, because, or different companies, you know, it's really supply chains that compete with each other, and you can't do that without visibility. Thank you. We had to rush a bit there, but I think we got the message across. I don't think there's much time for questions, but we have our little stand just outside here, so if there's any comments or anything you wish to raise, you know, be free to have a chat. Thank you.